Hi, I'm Tom Zimmerman, and this is the beginning of a series on predictive processing as we start to rethink our core metaphors for the neurobiology of trauma. And I wouldn't have guessed that I'd be the one here talking to you about this. I wouldn't have guessed this 5 years ago, 8 years ago, that I would be so interested in the neurobiology of trauma. I would have bet pretty good money against it. And until relatively recently, neurobiology was as interesting to me as the US tax code. But I am interested in healing, and I'm very interested in helping to facilitate healing for those who need it the most. Our stance and our interventions with our clients are directly related to what we think trauma is, how it lives in us, and how we might be able to charm it out. How we understand trauma matters. What a memory is matters. What a brain is and how it's organized and how it processes information matter. I'm here to talk about predictive processing, one of several newer ways of understanding the nervous system. A broad consensus is emerging across many neuroscience fields regarding the core role that largely unconscious predictions play in shaping perception, emotions, memory, learning, body regulation, and every other domain that the brain manages. Predictive processing is a remarkably simple concept. However, it's very different from how we've traditionally explained the brain as trauma therapists. It's different than how I've explained the brain in many of my writings and podcasts. Our classic understandings and metaphors inspired by triune brain model will need to be replaced or substantially reconceptualized, even if what I'm talking about today doesn't replace them. Predictive processing isn't just a more accurate understanding of how the brain is organized. It provides a broad conceptual foundation that solidly supports what EMDR therapy and other psychotherapies have been doing for decades by focusing on and leveraging present-based sensory attention. Predictive processing sounds weird at first, but through its lens, EMDR therapy becomes one of the most sensible approaches to psychotherapy that we can imagine. And as we'll see, predictive processing is excellent news for EMDR therapists. It may convincingly end our long search for EMDR's working mechanism. We shouldn't be surprised to learn that brains continually turn out to be more marvelous than we thought. The Egyptians believed it was a largely useless organ and pulled it out prior to mummification. Aristotle viewed the brain primarily as the radiator to help dissipate the heat of the heart. Our modern concept of the neuron and networks of neurons as the fundamental building block of the nervous system was first produced in the late 19th century, roughly the same time as the, emergence of the automobile. And as we'll see, our more modern understandings of the nervous system have been heavily shaped by broader cultural concepts. And a theme that we're going to encounter in this episode and in subsequent episodes is that we don't see or experience anything as it is. We see. We see the world, we see ourselves through the lens of our concepts and expectations. Some broader concepts that have been particularly influential in our modern understanding of the brain really couldn't have happened before they did. We needed the specialization of the Industrial Revolution and later really complex machinery before we could try to understand the brain as a kind of complex machine with regions that did specific and specialized things. We needed the cultural and scientific concept of a complex circuit before we could conceive of a brain as a cluster of communicating networks. And it was helpful to have cultural ideas that our realities are socially constructed, ideas that came out of philosophy, sociology, and found real root in the humanities, which was my first exposure to many of the ideas that we're talking about today over 35 years ago. May have been helpful to have those ideas out there circulating before neuroscience would plausibly say out loud that perception itself begins with our highly culturally shaped, internalized models of the world and not with our senses. Our understanding of the brain is likely always to be shaped and constrained by the landscape and the possibilities of our concepts. And we should just be a little bit humble. It's a deeply contemplative concept on a good day for a brain to try to understand itself, the way a knife struggles to cut itself. My guess is that when we talk about the brain, you and I, especially as therapists, we're typically in the land of metaphor. So before we talk about a new metaphor of the brain, let's explore one of our dominant metaphors of the brain, and then explore possibilities of some newer ones. And despite the hype, despite my excitement about this approach to understanding neurobiology, we can probably go in with the assurance that what is new and compelling and convincing right now will be quaint soon enough. Trauma therapists generally, and EMDR therapists specifically, have found deep resonance for decades in the triune brain model. And it was an improvement over prior understandings of the traumatized brain, and that it was less pathologizing than other keratological models were. In the triune brain lens, problems right now originate from brain structures that are millions of years old, and they're working the way they're supposed to. Paul MacLean, born 1913, I'm just going to emphasize that. Paul MacLean is who we get triune brain from. He was born in 1913, died 2007. He introduced this model in the 50s and 60s, and it became more popular in the 80s and subsequent decades. It is important to remember that triune brain was primarily an evolutionary model of the vertebrate brain that divides the human brain into three evolutionarily distinct and functionally separate regions. From bottom up, basal ganglia and brainstem forming the reptilian complex, the paleomammalian complex, also known as the limbic region, and the neomammalian complex, which we commonly refer to as the neocortex. Again, in the MacLean view, we have three separate brains pancaked on top of each other through millions of years of vertebrate evolution, which are now attempting to function together, three separate brains functioning together. So in 1969, a 1969 lecture, he writes the following quote, "These three brains might be thought of as biological computers, each with its own peculiar form of subjectivity, its own intelligence, its own sense of time and space, and its own memory, motor, and other functions. Based on behavioral observations of pathologists, their indications that the reptilian brain programs stereotype behaviors according to instructions based on ancestral learning and ancestral memories," end quote. These regions, which many of us have been trained in, you know, brainstem, limbic brain, neocortex, these regions feel somewhat intuitive as they imperfectly map onto Plato's tripartite soul and Freud's construct of id, ego, and superego, prior hierarchical understandings of the mind. Of particular interest to EMDR therapists is the limbic region of the brain, monitoring the internal and external worlds for signs of danger. Through the triune lens, the limbic brain was the land of salience and learning. It was the territory of our greatest fears and our strongest schemas. It's the place where we stored our best memory of chocolate, that incredibly sexy vacation weekend in New Orleans in the summer of '91. It was the home to addictions, fight and flight, the smoke detector of the amygdala, and it's where our emotions and our bad memories live. The limbic brain could be hijacked or could hijack other parts of your brain depending on how your metaphor leaned. In general, triune brain is a reactive one. It passively waits and then actively responds when triggered using programming that is millions of years old. Before triune brain, trauma responses and treatments were largely viewed through the lenses of character strength and or morality. Think about the treatments for shell shock or war neurosis. In triune understanding, trauma responses aren't really about you. They're automatic responses of a 150 million-year-old system designed to protect you. Through this lens, the utility of mindfulness is to help you settle your limbic brain so that the less reactive regions could be more prominent. Through the triune lens, EMDR is viewed predominantly as a limbic brain treatment, since that's where so many of the problematic features of trauma reside. So, okay, what's wrong with triune brain? At its core, triune brain is an evolutionary model of the brain. It reaches many conclusions about brain functioning, but a lot of its functional conclusions come from its cross-species evolutionary comparison. And an evolutionary model like this probably can't be substantially wrong about its evolutionary basis and still maintain substantial validity. Turns out, mammals did not evolve from reptile-like organisms. And to be fair, McLean didn't suggest that we evolved from the type of reptiles that are moving around today. The core idea that the newer brain structures were added on top of the older ones is one of the most central tenets of the triune brain model. The claim is simply not supported by evidence generated by professionals who do this research for their livelihoods, and it hasn't been for over 30 years. You'll have a hard time finding someone who'll even argue with you about this. Rather than adding entirely new structures, vertebrate evolution has consistently modified and further developed the existing ones. Even as triune brain was being developed and popularized, new advances in comparative neuroanatomy and later comparative genomics were challenging and ultimately undermining its conceptual foundation. Triune brain emerged using the best technology available in the late 1950s and 60s. Cross-species comparative studies of thinly sliced brain samples under a microscope. We now understand that visually similar or dissimilar brain structures can be formed from essentially the same types of cells and genes. So visual similarities or differences between different regions of the brain across species simply doesn't reveal what McLean inferred that it does. Okay, triune brain has some challenges evolutionarily. What about functionally? Clearly, triune brain isn't wrong in that whatever is going on with trauma heavily implicates regions of the brain that we associate with the limbic territories. And clearly, the part of our brain called the neocortex is different and is newer than what we find in brains that were around many millions of years before ours. From our perspective as trauma therapists, is there still utility in describing things like the smoke detector of the amygdala? Can triune brain be right functionally or even metaphorically if it's wrong evolutionarily? Maybe. But more modern concepts of brain functioning are moving away from the idea that brain structures only do specific tasks. We're pretty sure that we do not have a single fight-flight circuit that runs through the amygdala. We're reasonably sure that emotions don't live in the limbic brain. And we're very sure that brain regions do not function largely, mostly, or even partly independently of each other, the way the triune brain models suggest. Parts of the limbic brain are not inactive and then light up when something activates it. Lights up is a metaphor that we use to describe things like fMRI data, which themselves are statistical byproducts of very specific thresholds set by the researcher and only get meaning when compared to a control state. So, in some research, what we describe as the limbic brain lighting up may reflect only a few percentage points difference when compared to a non-activated state. We now understand that all parts of your brain are always on until you die, and they're deeply and intimately interconnected. We're becoming more and more convinced that the brain is not a reactive system using hardwired mechanisms that are many millions of years old, the way the triune brain models suggest. Is the triune brain still useful if we remove the concept of three functionally separate brains fighting for control? That there is no single hardwired fear circuit, and that we update it to clarify what limbic regions lighting up means? Maybe. But isn't that a lot of its utility? If we're going to try to update triune brain, then we need to figure out how to do that. It's hung on in large part because it served us well, metaphorically. It's hung on in large part because it's been endlessly taught to us for 50 years. We can learn new things because this world contains them. So, Tom, why does it matter? Let's suppose it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't, but I'll only suggest that it's reasonable that trauma therapists shouldn't teach the neurobiology of trauma in ways that most brain scientists view as antiquated. Neurobiology is the stuff they do all day. That's not our field. It's a problem if how we explain the neurobiology of trauma comes from a view that can be easily disproven by our clients with a simple Google search. And if you doubt me, pause right here and Google triune brain, see what comes up over and over and over. Many of our metaphors come from a worldview that is far older than I am, and I have gray hair. We've learned a lot about how the human brain has evolved, is organized, and functions in the last 50 years, and particularly in the last 15 years. And at this moment, psychologists, social workers, and counselors are some of the last professionals on the planet who still conceptualize in classic triune brain language and metaphors. If there is something really compelling in talking about specific regions of the brain and how they influence each other related to trauma, network neuroscience is probably the layer of abstraction that would most resonate for you and would probably provide a compelling and, to be honest, maybe a less dramatic jump from the familiar than what predictive processing proposes. And of course, predictive processing and network neuroscience aren't opposing. They're just looking at really similar things from different layers. I think we're going to be hearing a lot about the default mode network, the salience network, and the central executive network in relation to trauma. And if you want to kind of get an intro to this, Jen and Bridger on the Notice That podcast, if you Google Notice That podcast, are doing a series on network neuroscience. It would be a pretty good place to start. Updating our understanding of the neurobiology of trauma will require updating our language, and we're going to need to develop new metaphors. Again, therapists are metaphorical people. As we switch from a reactive brain to a predictive or adaptive brain, brand new possibilities emerge. And despite me being kind of hard on triune brain, I'm not here to give triune brain's eulogy. I want to talk about newer ways of conceptualizing neurobiology that are remarkably good news for EMDR therapists. And out of this newer conceptualization, we may be able to understand trauma so much better. We may have a clearer than ever understanding of how we update it and be very clear in our own minds what we're updating. Predictive processing promises things. It promises so much, including the real possibility of healing and better understanding ourselves.